In the southern stretches of Texas, where the heat of the day lingered even after sunset and neon lights flickered over quiet streets, four friends came together with a shared dream. Alex, Michael, Sarah, and Jake formed a rock band they called Lone Lights. Their rehearsals began in garages and abandoned warehouses, where the hum of amplifiers mixed with the cries of cicadas outside. At first, their goal was simple: to create songs that captured their restless youth and to feel alive under the glow of stage lights. When they finally stepped onto makeshift stages in small bars and roadside venues, something unusual began to happen. The audience felt more than just excitement from their performance. People described a strange calm settling over them, as though their inner fears loosened their grip. Listeners confessed that recurring nightmares vanished after hearing the music, and long-held sorrows seemed lighter. The band had not expected such reactions, but the pattern grew undeniable. It was not only the crowd that changed. The members of Lone Lights noticed shadows at the edges of their vision during performances. These were not ordinary shapes cast by stage lights, but darker forms that lingered, bending unnaturally, sometimes following the rhythm of the songs. The more they played, the more frequent these appearances became, as though the music itself was summoning what had hidden beneath the surface of the town. At first, they tried to dismiss the incidents, convincing themselves that fatigue and imagination were at fault. Yet the testimonies of fans painted a different picture. Families told of nights without terror for the first time in years, and individuals who had carried despair spoke of sudden clarity after concerts. Lone Lights began to wonder if the power within their music extended beyond entertainment. One evening, after a particularly intense set in a rundown club, they watched as a shadow detach itself from the corner and dissolved into nothing with the final note of their song. The realization struck them collectively. Their music was more than a performance. It resonated with forces unseen, pushing back something hostile that lingered in the streets and alleys. This marked the beginning of a transformation. They were no longer only musicians chasing recognition. With each chord and each lyric, they tapped into a strength that shielded the vulnerable and disturbed what hid in darkness. The stage had become both battlefield and sanctuary. Their first steps into this hidden war were unplanned, but the path had been laid before them. The journey of Lone Lights began not only with ambition, but with the awakening of a power that tied their destiny to the unseen struggle between light and shadow. After a late evening performance in a small suburb, the members of Lone Lights packed their instruments into the back of an old van. The night stretched wide and silent around them, broken only by the hum of distant highway traffic. Then, carried on the dry desert wind, came a sound that unsettled them. It was not the usual whisper of air through trees, but something more deliberate, like static from forgotten radios. The tones wavered between faint cries and fractured words, as if an old broadcast were struggling to reach them from another world. Alex, restless and curious, moved toward the sound. His footsteps crunched over gravel as the air grew colder. In the dim light of the street lamps, he began to see figures forming. They were pale outlines, translucent bodies drifting against the backdrop of the empty street. Their faces were marked by sorrow, their eyes hollow yet pleading, and their movements suggested people who had once belonged to the town but had long since vanished. The others joined him, and together they felt the weight of the spirit's longing. These were not malevolent presences, but lost souls, unable to escape the silence that bound them. Their faint moans blended with the whispering static, creating a mournful chorus that filled the night. Lone Lights realized the shadows they had sensed before were only fragments of a greater truth. Their music touched not only the living, but also the unseen remnants of lives once lived. Without hesitation, they unpacked their instruments and let instinct guide them. Alex struck the first chords, Sarah layered soft notes above them, Michael provided a steady rhythm, and Jake added depth with resonant bass lines. The improvised melody carried warmth and intention, weaving together comfort and release. As the sound rose, the spectral forms began to react. Their expressions softened, their outlines shimmered, and one by one they dissolved into the night air, as though the music had finally given them the passage they sought. For a brief moment, silence returned, heavy and absolute. Yet within that silence, another presence stirred. Watching from the edges of the street were figures that did not dissolve, figures with sharper outlines and eyes too focused to belong to the lost. They appeared human, but carried a tension in their stance, as if hiding a truth beneath borrowed faces. The air around them felt charged, not with sorrow, but with hunger. The band sensed they were no longer dealing with only restless spirits. Something darker had taken notice. The melody had revealed their power, and now new eyes followed them. Lone lights left the suburb knowing their path had shifted again. The night voices had been silenced, but a greater threat had stepped into the shadows, drawn closer with every note they played. In the heart of Houston, an abandoned cinema loomed like a scar from another time. Its marquee still clung to the walls, faded letters barely visible under layers of soot and dust. Years earlier, a fire had closed the theater, leaving it empty. Yet whispers in the city claimed something darker had taken root inside. Lone lights followed those whispers, believing the building concealed a fragment of the force that had begun shadowing their path. Inside, the air carried the scent of smoke long settled into the walls. The lobby was cluttered with broken seats, scattered ticket stubs, and fragments of burned posters. Silence pressed against them, broken only by their footsteps as they ventured deeper. When they entered the main auditorium, the ruined screen suddenly flickered to life. Its glow was pale but strong enough to trap them. The room transformed into a maze of corridors and shifting doors, each passage leading them farther away from one another. The screen no longer displayed old films, but reached into their minds, pulling forth their fears and failures. Sarah walked through hallways where the laughter of children echoed, only to reveal scenes of her own childhood, fragile and fractured by moments of isolation. Michael stumbled into visions of stages where he played alone, every note failing, the silence of an absent audience crushing his spirit. Jake wandered through empty rooms filled with shadows that whispered abandonment, amplifying the weight of loneliness that had haunted him for years. Alex faced darker halls where betrayal returned again and again, faces he once trusted turning away, leaving him stranded in echoes of resentment. Each of them struggled against illusions that seemed designed to weaken and consume. The corridors bent to the rhythm of fear, and the harder they tried to escape alone, the deeper the labyrinth swallowed them. But through the fog of confusion, faint traces of their band's music began to stir. The sound was fragile at first, like a thread stretched across endless darkness, yet it grew stronger as each of them remembered their bond. Alex struck a steady rhythm against the wall, his heartbeat guiding the tempo. Sarah answered with soft, luminous notes carried by her voice. Michael added patterns of percussion, sharp and certain, while Jake anchored them with a deep pulse that vibrated through the halls. Their fears still surrounded them, but instead of resisting, they folded those weaknesses into the sound. Each flaw became part of the composition, each shadow given shape and meaning through harmony. The labyrinth began to unravel. Walls cracked like brittle glass, corridors fell into dust, and the screen burned out in a surge of light. The illusions dissolved, leaving only the four of them standing in the ashes of the auditorium. The theater itself groaned as if collapsing under the weight of its own forgotten memories, and then it gave way, crumbling into ruin. When they stepped back into the night, the city lights seemed brighter, the air cleaner, though a trace of smoke still lingered on their clothes. They had faced the theater's trials and emerged not only unbroken, but stronger. Their unity had turned fear into strength, and the theater of oblivion was no more. The night of the Dallas concert drew thousands into the stadium, a sea of restless anticipation beneath glowing floodlights. The stage towered above them, wrapped in shadows until the first chords cut through the air. Lone lights stood at the center, their instruments glowing beneath the beams, ready to channel their sound into something greater than performance. At first, the crowd was electric with energy, bodies moving in rhythm, voices rising like waves against the stage. But as the music deepened, unfamiliar figures began to emerge among the living. Faces appeared where none had been, pale and transparent, their eyes hollow yet yearning. These were not ordinary fans, but remnants of lives once lost. Spirits tethered by their love of music, drawn back to the world through the vibration of sound. The band felt the shift before the audience noticed. The air grew heavier, as if every note carved open a door between worlds. Some spirits swayed silently with the rhythm, while others stood rigid, shadows clinging to their forms, unable to find peace. The living began to sense them, whispers of cold air brushing shoulders, sudden silences breaking the roar of the crowd. Alex raised his guitar and shifted the tone, leading the group into a piece that pulsed with warmth and clarity. Sarah's voice rose above the chords, carrying words that seemed older than language, a hymn shaped by intention rather than meaning. Michael's drums thundered like a heartbeat, steady in chaos, while Jake's bass resonated with deep currents, grounding the fragile space between the living and the dead. Each song became more than music. It turned into a rite of passage, a cleansing wave that reached both the visible and the unseen. The crowd began to move differently, no longer just celebrating, but participating, as if the stadium itself had transformed into a vast temple. Light seemed to shimmer across the audience, bending in time with the melodies, until the phantoms began to fade. One by one, the hollow-eyed figures dissolved into streams of brightness. They left not in anguish, but in calm release, carrying with them traces of gratitude, silent acknowledgments of the gift they had been given. The final note lingered like incense in the night air, and when it fell into silence, the stadium erupted in awestruck applause, unaware of the full weight of what had passed. News spread quickly through the city, whispered first as rumor, then carried as truth. Lone Light's concerts were no longer just performances. They had become something sacred, places where unseen forces gathered and were set free. The people of Dallas left with the memory of music that felt larger than sound, as if they had witnessed a miracle hidden in plain sight. Light seemed to shimmer across the audience, bending in time with the melodies, until the phantoms began to fade. One by one, the hollow-eyed figures dissolved into streams of brightness. They left not in anguish, but in calm release, carrying with them traces of gratitude, silent acknowledgments of the gift they had been given. The final note lingered like incense in the night air, and when it fell into silence, the stadium erupted in awestruck applause, unaware of the full weight of what had passed. News spread quickly through the city, whispered first as rumor, then carried as truth. Lone Light's concerts were no longer just performances. They had become something sacred, places where unseen forces gathered and were set free. The people of Dallas left with the memory of music that felt larger than sound, as if they had witnessed a miracle hidden in plain sight. The people of Dallas left with the memory of music that felt larger than sound, as if they had witnessed a miracle hidden in plain sight. When Lone Lights arrived in Austin for their next performance, they discovered a storm already brewing in the heart of the city. Billboards and posters bore the faces of another rising band, Black Sun, whose sudden fame had eclipsed every local act within weeks. Their concerts drew massive crowds, and the air buzzed with fascination around their name. Yet beneath the glamour, something felt unnatural. On the night they first witnessed Black Sun perform, the truth revealed itself. The stage pulsed with crimson light, and the music carried a strange hypnotic cadence. Each chord coiled around the listeners like a chain, pulling their minds into submission. The audience swayed in unison, their expressions drained of vitality, as if the sound had stolen the spark from their souls. Energy rose from the crowd not as joy, but as a tide of weakness, absorbed into the figures commanding the stage. The members of Lone Lights sensed the distortion immediately. These were not ordinary musicians chasing fame. They were predators wrapped in the guise of idols, weaving melodies that drained rather than healed. Behind their practiced smiles and polished movements lay a hunger older than the city itself. Their songs did not simply entertain, but enslaved, bending the will of thousands into fuel for something darker. The rivalry was inevitable. Each performance from Black Sun seemed like a challenge hurled directly at Lone Lights, as if the two groups were destined to collide. Venues became arenas, where audiences unknowingly became the prize. Lone Lights poured their strength into sets that lifted hearts, while Black Sun countered with rhythms that ensnared them again. Music became weapon and shield, the stage a battlefield where no sword was drawn, yet every soul hung in the balance. With each duel of sound, the atmosphere thickened. The crowds grew restless, torn between two forces pulling at them from opposite ends of the spectrum. Lone Lights played with the intention of release, guiding spirits to freedom, while Black Sun drove their rhythms deeper, locking chains tighter with every verse. The clash echoed far beyond the stage, leaving behind cities charged with invisible tension, as if light and shadow had both left their mark. For Lone Lights, the realization cut deeper than rivalry. They were no longer battling shadows or memories, but enemies who shared the same stage, hidden in plain sight. The fight for music was no longer about fame or recognition. It had become a struggle for the very essence of those who listened. On the outskirts of San Antonio, a new carnival rose almost overnight, its lights flashing like beacons against the desert dusk. From afar, it looked alive with joy, a place where children's laughter and music promised escape from the weight of daily life. Yet as Lone Lights stepped through its gates, the illusion unraveled. The cheerful melodies warped into dissonant shrieks, and the laughter curdled into cries that echoed through the night air. The rides twisted unnaturally, moving without riders, their gears grinding against themselves like creatures gnashing their teeth. The carousel spun endlessly, its painted horses flickering between innocence and grotesque distortions, their hollow eyes reflecting the glow of the firelit midway. Clowns stalked the grounds, their painted faces stretched into masks too rigid to be human. Their gestures exaggerated as they drifted between menace and mockery. Every corner of the carnival shifted and folded like a stage set rearranging itself, trapping the group in a labyrinth of horrors where each step led to a new scene of madness. The demons lurking beneath the disguises fed on confusion and fear, twisting the joy of the place into a nightmare. Lone Lights felt the weight of the enchantment pressing on their senses, pulling them into illusions designed to drown them in despair. Yet even in the distortion, they understood that only their music could cut through the chaos. They raised their instruments amid the swirling madness, striking chords that resonated against the carnival's false reality. The melodies grew stronger with every note, their harmonies weaving a rhythm that tore at the fabric of the illusion. The rides began to shudder, the distorted laughter fractured into silence, and the demons' painted faces cracked to reveal the void beneath. As the music swelled, a storm of sound spun outward, scattering the illusions like paper in the wind. The carnival collapsed in on itself, its lights sputtering out, its tents dissolving into ash and sparks. When the final note lingered, there was nothing left but a scorched field, the acrid scent of smoke clinging to the air. Lone Lights stood in the emptiness, their breaths heavy, their instruments still trembling from the force of their playing. The blood carnival was gone, erased by the power of their song, but the memory of its horrors remained like a scar across the night. In the heart of Austin, Lone Lights discovered an abandoned recording studio hidden among crumbling brick walls and shuttered windows. Dust clung to every surface, and the once bright posters of past legends faded into shadows. The air carried a stillness heavy with forgotten dreams, yet beneath it pulsed a faint vibration, as though the walls themselves remembered the music that had once filled them. As they explored the rooms, faint echoes began to emerge. Soft notes, incomplete chords, and fractured rhythms drifted through the air like voices calling from another time. The group realized these were not simple echoes, but remnants of songs left unfinished by musicians long since gone. Their creativity had outlived their bodies, suspended between silence and eternity, and the studio had become a prison for these wandering melodies. When the instruments of Lone Lights touched the soundboard, the energy shifted. Strings hummed without being plucked, and microphones caught whispers that were not spoken by living mouths. The room vibrated with restless harmonies that yearned for release. The band began to play, weaving their own music into the fragments of the spectral songs. Each note they struck merged with the voices of the past, building bridges between generations. The collaboration was unlike anything they had ever created. Guitars rose and fell in conversation with ghostly riffs. Drums echoed alongside rhythms that had never been completed. And Sarah's voice carried the weight of singers who had been silenced. Together, they built a tapestry of sound that filled the studio until the walls seemed ready to burst. As the final chords rang out, the restless energy lifted. The lingering melodies dissipated like morning mist, carrying with them the presence of the souls who had been trapped for decades. The studio felt lighter, its silence no longer oppressive but peaceful, as though it could finally rest. For Lone Lights, the experience left more than relief. They understood now that their mission stretched far beyond confronting demons in the shadows of cities. Their music reached the lost and the forgotten, those who lingered between worlds waiting for closure. Their path was no longer just about protecting the living. It was also about honoring the exiled voices that history had abandoned. For Lone Lights, the experience left more than relief. They understood now that their mission stretched far beyond confronting demons in the shadows of cities. Their music reached the lost and the forgotten, those who lingered between worlds waiting for closure. Their path was no longer just about protecting the living. It was also about honoring the exiled voices that history had abandoned.